So in Advent, we talked about God coming and uncomfortableness. Christmas was celebration, and last week was more about thankfulness and gratitude and using the Beatitudes as a framework, I guess, for gratitude. And I was very pleased that people actually remembered more. We now know that sermons are more memorable than your envelope number. That's what this morning's experiment has proven. So this is a good thing. And so last week was about the Beatitudes, and if you did your homework, you will remember that one of the things was to try and pick just one line from a verse of the Bible or a song that you like, or just something that was meaningful, and make that a verse for the year. And one of the things that struck me as I prepared for last week was that the Beatitude, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted," was a bit of, well, what's the difference between that and grieving? And there was one quite intriguing piece on the internet that talked about how mourning, that particular Beatitude was very specific about mourning your own spiritual state with God, and from that comes the blessing of the fruits of the Spirit, so love and joy and peace, and it actually writes down here patience and kindness and goodness and so on. But given that the church, we are at a point of change with Nick coming next week and launched last Sunday a couple of weeks ago, and it felt quite different last week actually, despite the fact in many ways it wasn't. It felt different. To me, at least. It felt that it would be worth thinking a little bit about grieving and mourning and how that fits in a more biblical context and how that change works out. So this is the musings of a few days thinking about that over the course of the last week. So if "Blessed are they who mourn" had a very specific context, and the grieving part is much more about how do you deal with loss of loved ones, loss of a pet, loss of a relationship, loss of a dream, anything, even a change when you move to university or move to leave home. All of these things are both new things, beginnings and endings, and there's a bit of a grieving process that goes with the endings. And there are lots of, not lots, but several models. If you look on the internet, there's these are the stages of grief, and this is how the emotions work, and it can be anger and denial and acceptance and shock and bargaining, and you can Google, except Gail, you can all Google as well as I can and go and look at them. But the one thing that really comes across is that there's no one specific model. There's no formula. There's no exact science to it. It can take a long time. It can take a short time. It can be lots of things simultaneously. It can be one thing after another. The one thing that it does seem there seems to be agreement on is that not grieving where grieving is needed is a very bad thing, because it means that you don't express emotions that need to be expressed. You don't follow a process that needs to be followed. And the other is that staying in a grieving process too long is also not a good thing. You end up not moving on, not living life afterwards. So then I started to look a little bit in the Bible about, well, did Jesus grieve? And the one, it's coincidental actually that today is John the Baptist's day, or the readings were about John the Baptist, because John, if you remember, John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. So I initially started off thinking, well, they must know each other, because if you remember the story, when Elizabeth, John's mother, was pregnant, Mary went to stay with her, so they spent 6 months, I think, together. So I think it's a fair bet that clearly the mums knew each other. Then I started to look around. Did John the Baptist and Jesus know each other? And there's lots of debate about this point. So let's assume they did for the purpose of the sermon. I don't think it really matters too much. But then, if you remember, John the Baptist, he was a prophet. He was in the desert. He was preaching the gospel of repentance. I guess he was preaching, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God," at the start of the Beatitudes. And he was quite outspoken, and eventually he found himself in prison because he'd upset King Herod one time too many, I guess. And as a small aside, Gail asked me to do a favour, a very modest favour this morning, which was very easy to do. But if you've ever if you've ever been in that position where you've offered something to someone, you said, "Oh yeah, I'll do that for you," or "Yeah, sure, I can do that," or whatever it is, and then you thought, "Why did I do that?" Well, King Herod did that. He was there. He was. Maybe this is the state where these promises are more often made than not. He was having a party. He was drinking wine, and his teenage daughter or stepdaughter or someone came up to him and said, "Hey, Uncle Herod, can you do me a favour?" So he said, "Sure, anything you want," in an expansive mode. And she said, "Bring me the head of John the Baptist on a plate." I don't think I wanted to do that, but he'd promised and he had to go and do it. So it's just a small aside to the rest of the sermon, really, that it struck me that because it's something I do, and I try not to, but I do it. It just struck me as a useful aside to be careful what you promise, because you might have to go and do it. So anyway, so John's head was duly beheaded, and his disciples came and buried him. And then what the Gospels tell us is that Jesus, when he heard that, his response was to go away and pray. He wanted some solitude. He wanted to go and be with his dad, I guess, to spend some time alone. So he went off up to the hills. Now, I don't know whether this would resonate with any of you, but you know those times where you sit down for a quiet cup of tea or your quiet TV show, and the phone rings, or your children arrive with a requirement, or your husband arrives with a requirement, or any one of a million things that comes and disturbs your peace. Work often does it too. Well, Jesus found himself in that position, that he went off to find solitude. Unfortunately, the disciples and 5,000 people showed up as well, which is not the usual definition of solitude. So instead of telling people to go away, I'm enjoying my peace and quiet, which I'm sure is what as he was human, I'm sure that's what he felt like doing. But look, I'm grieving here. I need to go and do some praying. I need to go think by myself. He did not do that. He taught. He ministered. He gave himself to the disciples. He gave himself to the people who were there. And he did what he needed to do as ministry before he then went off and finally found some quiet. And then what's that progression then? So it starts, and the Beatitudes are a progression. You start off being poor in spirit, and then you mourn the state, and then the next one is blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So the state beyond the next step, if you like, from the mourning is obedience, it's gentleness, it's kindness, it's compassion, all the things that Jesus showed in that act of feeding the 5,000 and doing his ministry rather than taking himself off. And that's and I think that's the response that I think is a useful one to grieving, is to be compassionate and to use that experience and to use that knowledge and that the feelings that you've had as a compassionate response to others, rather than a selfish response or a self-serving response. And that really also sums up the other question that I kind of asked this week, is like, if I'm this crazy, how on earth can a sermon be useful, or can we help each other? And the answer is that we're all broken, and we're all sinners, and we've all got lots of things that we're grieving, things that we have grieved, and things that we will grieve in the future. But it doesn't mean that we can't be useful to God. It doesn't mean we can't serve God, and it doesn't mean that we can't serve each other. In fact, God has no choice other than coming and intervening directly with each one of us other than letting us be compassionate to each other and use our experiences to help each other. And the how do we show compassion is probably the subject of another sermon, but maybe it's sitting in silence with someone, maybe it's just listening, maybe it's practical help, maybe it's just helping someone work through things. That's an individual thing for an individual time. But certainly, I think that's a better response than the self-pity and self-worrying to a grieving process. So then Jesus, after he had prayed, the next event was that the disciples had left him alone, gone out to sit on a boat, if you remember. And I guess this is the sort of thing you can do when you're God, is that rather than disturb them and get them to bring the ship to shore, he just decided he'd walk on the water to the ship, to the boat. And Peter said, well, I'd like to walk too. So he tried, and he tried for a bit, and then it all went wrong. And it struck me that was actually quite a good follow-on from the thought of compassion, that the next thing that happened after that is that somebody went and tried something by themselves, had an act of faith, but when it didn't quite work, there was Jesus to reach out and support and guide and hold, and give the courage that it was a good thing that he did. Because ultimately, I think, despite the fact that we are supposed to grieve, and Jesus was very compassionate with people who were grieving in other stories in the Bible, we're not supposed to stay there forever. We're not supposed to live in fear forever. But at some point, we're supposed to step out like Peter did, and that when we do overreach, Jesus will be there, or friends or family or people who are there in his name to hold a hand and tell us to take courage and to keep going. So, and that's I think that's why I read the piece from Isaiah at the start, that in a sense the purpose of the healing of God is to turn that grieving into joy, into righteousness. So that was the sort of the flow of the process, if you like. So from recognizing there was something to grieve, to grieving it through, to a change process, to not change process, but to changing, to reaching out, letting God support you if it falls, and then the turning of that grief into something joyful. So it felt that at a time of it felt that in a time of change, and a time where lots of things are being grieved and there's lots of things going on, it was just worth thinking about that specific part of the Beatitudes of blessed are they that mourn, and then what does that mean for us? And I guess finally I took some comfort for the fact that that's sort of what Jesus did when he came to earth. Is he was grieving very much the walls that people put around them, the way that we stop God being with us, and his response to that was always compassionate, was always to take care of people while he was on the earth, even to the point of dying on the cross.